Women are often the unsung heroes of many historical tales.
The Igbo Women's War of 1929, also known as the Aba Women's Riot, was one of the most notable events of this time period.
A group of women in Nigeria organizing a women-only anti-colonial protest in the 1920s.
Is often told through the lens of victors. But what about the stories buried beneath the sands of time? In the early 20th century, colonial Nigeria was ablaze with resistance, but few know of the extraordinary Igbo Women's War of 1929. This wasn't just an uprising, it was a seismic revolt that shook the foundations of British imperial rule in Africa. But how did ordinary women ignite such a fierce rebellion? And why has their story been largely forgotten? To understand this remarkable chapter, we must travel back to colonial Nigeria, a mosaic of rich traditions, vibrant cultures, and oppressive foreign rule. The Igbo people, known for their communal living and democratic leadership structures, found themselves under the shadow of British indirect rule. This system, though hailed as efficient by the colonizers, disrupted indigenous governance, replacing it with warrant chiefs, men handpicked by the British to enforce their will. For the Igbo, especially the women, this was an insult to their centuries-old traditions, where women played crucial roles in decision-making and societal balance. By 1929, life under colonial rule had become unbearable. Heavy taxation, economic exploitation, and cultural erasure were the order of the day. The introduction of cash crops over subsistence farming destabilized communities, forcing men to migrate for work and leaving women to fend for families amidst rising costs and dwindling resources. Tensions boiled over when rumors spread that women would soon be taxed, a policy unheard of in Igbo tradition. The colonial administration underestimated the Igbo women's strength and resolve. Unlike the men, who were often co-opted or silenced, Igbo women had a unique weapon: their unity. Through a practice called sitting on a man, they used collective protests to shame corrupt leaders and demand justice. But this time their target was the colonial regime itself. The stage was set for an extraordinary act of defiance. The women organized across villages, mobilizing tens of thousands in what would come to be known as the Aba Women's Riot, or, more aptly, the Igbo Women's War. It wasn't just a protest against taxation, it was a rebellion against the very fabric of colonial oppression. They chanted, danced, and wielded symbolic power, challenging the British with a resilience that stunned the empire. But what was the outcome of this bold resistance? How did the actions of these fearless women alter the course of Nigerian history? The Igbo Women's War was unlike anything the British colonial government had encountered in Africa. It wasn't a war fought with weapons, but with strategy, solidarity, and unyielding courage. Over 25,000 women from various Igbo and Ibibio communities came together in a powerful display of unity. Their coordinated efforts, stretching across multiple towns, were a masterclass in grassroots mobilization. The protests began in late November 1929, with women gathering at local administrative centers. They sang songs laced with defiance, danced in unison, and used their collective voices to demand the removal of warrant chiefs and an end to oppressive policies. The tactic of sitting on a man, a form of public shaming rooted in Igbo tradition, was elevated to unprecedented scales. Through this, the women exposed the chiefs' collaboration with colonial authorities and highlighted their betrayal of the community. This uprising wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate and deeply strategic. Women traveled from village to village, spreading the call for rebellion. They leveraged existing networks like market associations and kinship groups to coordinate their actions, ensuring that their protests were synchronized across vast territories. The colonial government, accustomed to fragmenting resistance through divide and rule tactics, was caught off guard by the women's unprecedented unity. The British response was swift and brutal. Armed colonial forces were deployed to quell the protests. On several occasions, peaceful demonstrators were met with violence. Women were shot at, beaten, and imprisoned. In the towns of Aba, Opobo, and Owerri, clashes turned deadly, with over 50 women losing their lives and many others injured. Yet their resolve did not waver. They understood the stakes. They were not just fighting for their rights, but for the survival of their culture and dignity. Amid the chaos, the colonial authorities were forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The women's demands could not be ignored. The power dynamics between the colonizers and the colonized were shifting, and the Igbo women had proven that even the most marginalized could bring an empire to its knees. The Igbo Women's War of 1929 did not result in an immediate overthrow of colonial rule, but its impact rippled across Nigeria and beyond, influencing the course of history. The bravery and determination of the Igbo women forced the British colonial government to re-evaluate their governance strategies and shed light on the resilience of African societies. In the short term, the colonial administration abolished the warrant chief system in many areas, recognizing that the imposed structure had failed to align with the traditional ways of governance in Igbo society. Warrant chiefs, who had been central to the women's grievances, were either dismissed or their powers were significantly curtailed. This restructuring was a direct result of the women's uprising, showcasing their ability to enact meaningful change despite the limitations imposed by colonial oppression. Beyond administrative reforms, the Igbo Women's War drew attention to the broader injustices of British colonial rule. The protest exposed the exploitative nature of colonial policies, particularly taxation and forced labour, which burdened local communities. It also highlighted the unique role of women in African resistance movements, challenging the perception that political activism in colonial Africa was exclusively male-driven. However, the women paid a heavy price for their defiance. The British response to the uprising was violent and oppressive, resulting in the deaths of over 50 women and injuries to many more. Entire communities were punished, with homes and crops destroyed as a warning against future revolts. The trauma of these events left scars on the affected regions, but it also deepened the resolve of many Nigerians to resist colonial domination. Despite these sacrifices, the Igbo Women's War was a turning point. It planted the seeds for subsequent resistance movements that would eventually lead to Nigeria's independence in 1960. The war demonstrated that collective action, even without weapons, could challenge an empire. This lesson resonated far beyond Nigeria, inspiring other anti-colonial movements across Africa. Yet for decades, the contributions of the Igbo women were largely overlooked. The colonial government dismissed the uprising as a mere riot, a term used to downplay its significance and portray the women as unruly rather than strategic. History books written during the colonial and early post-independence periods often ignored or minimized the event, focusing instead on male-led resistance movements. This erasure of the women's contributions was a disservice not only to their legacy, but also to the broader understanding of African resistance. In recent years, however, efforts have been made to reclaim and celebrate the history of the Igbo Women's War. Scholars, historians, and activists have worked to uncover the stories of the women who led the protests, ensuring that their bravery and strategic brilliance are recognized. The rebranding of the event as the Igbo Women's War, rather than the Aba Women's Riot, is part of this effort, emphasizing the scale and significance of their resistance. Today, the Igbo Women's War is a source of inspiration for those fighting against injustice worldwide. It serves as a reminder that meaningful change often begins with those who refuse to accept the status quo. The women's ability to organize across communities, use traditional practices as tools of resistance, and confront a powerful colonial regime demonstrates the power of unity and determination. The lessons of the Igbo Women's War are especially relevant in today's world. It reminds us of the importance of amplifying marginalized voices, standing up against systemic injustices, and recognizing the contributions of women in shaping history. The story of these women challenges us to think critically about whose narratives are prioritized, and to ensure that the voices of the oppressed are not forgotten. As we reflect on the legacy of the Igbo Women's War, we must honor the sacrifices of those who fought for justice and freedom. Their courage is a testament to the strength of ordinary people when they come together to challenge oppression. Their story, once buried, now stands as a beacon of hope and a call to action for all who seek to make the world a fairer and more equitable place. By understanding and sharing this history, we ensure that the Igbo women's legacy lives on, inspiring generations to rise against injustice and reminding us that even the most marginalized have the power to change the course of history. The Igbo Women's War is not just a story of the past, it is a lesson for the future. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed learning about this incredible history, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories of resilience and forgotten legacies. Stay tuned for our next video,